Okay, folks, please get seated. We're going to get started. Okay, I'm very pleased. So welcome to the IMA public lecture. I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Randall LeVeque from the University of Washington. Randy received his PhD from Stanford University in computer science in 1982. After his PhD, he held appointments at the Courant Institute for Mathematical Sciences at NYU and also at UCLA. He joined the faculty of the University of Washington in 1985, and until recently held appointments in both the Department of Mathematics and the Department of Applied Mathematics. He's now professor in applied mathematics at the University of Washington. Randy is well known for his research in numerical methods and software for solving partial differential equations. His honors include the National Science Foundation's Presidential Young Investigator Award. He's fellow of the Society for Industrial and Applied Mathematics and fellow of the American Mathematical Society. In addition, he has held term distinguished professorships at the University of Washington. Most recently, Randy was named the 2015 Co-Motion Presidential Innovation Fellow by the University of Washington's president. Randy is author of 4 very influential books on numerical methods for partial differential equations. He's author of 2 software packages. You can check it out later after the talk. One is called ClawPack. The other one is called GeoClaw. A lot of what he's going to talk about is simulated by these software packages. Both of these have a very active and growing research community. So tonight's talk is modeling tsunamis and geohazards. This is very appropriate because we are now at 3 years after, 5 years after the famous Tohoku event in Japan. I think you'll enjoy this talk, so please give a warm welcome to Professor LeVeque.
Thank you, Fadil, for that nice introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. So I want to talk about some of the work we've been doing on modeling tsunamis and other geohazards. Actually, I'm going to focus almost entirely on tsunamis, although this software has been used for various other geohazards, and a lot of what I'll talk about carries over in various ways to other hazards. But there's a lot to say just about tsunamis and various aspects of how mathematics comes into the study of these sort of geohazards. So I'll focus on that. And it's, I think, particularly appropriate since, as Fadil mentioned, tomorrow is the 5th anniversary of the Tohoku event, as geoscientists call it, the tsunami, the earthquake off the coast of Japan, and the resulting tsunami. And this is one of the events that we've been studying and using the wealth of data that's come from that to sort of better understand earthquakes and tsunamis, and also numerical methods, and to validate some of our methods. So the picture that's on the screen here, this is the tsunami 9 hours after the earthquake as it's propagating across the Pacific Ocean. The red here is elevation above sea level. The dark blue is below sea level. It's actually only an amplitude of less than a meter at this point. This is a scale of 50 centimeters here. What these traces show over here is measurements and simulations of the tsunami as it went by 4 different points here that are marked with numbers. There are pressure gauges out on the bottom of the Pacific that were put in place specifically for measuring tsunamis as they go by, called DART buoys. The buoy floats on top and transmits data to a satellite. But on the bottom of the ocean are the pressure gauges that can measure the weight of the water accurately enough that they can sense the tides going up and down and a tsunami going by. And then that's used in warning. So in this case, for example, warning people on the west coast of the US or in Hawaii about whether they had to evacuate or not. So that's a very important sort of piece of data that can be used also for validating our numerical methods. So the method that I'll be talking about today that's implemented in this GeoClaw package gives very similar traces to what was actually recorded at these DART gauges. The wavelength of one of these tsunami waves, if we go back here and look at this, the amplitude is maybe only half a meter, but the wavelength can be hundreds of kilometers. And so there's a lot of energy in these waves, even though they're fairly small amplitude. And because it's such a long wavelength, when it comes to shore, it doesn't just go up and down like a wind-driven wave that you're used to seeing on the beach. It starts coming in, and it comes in for a long time before it starts receding because it has such a long period. So if you remember these images from 5 years ago in Japan, this is on the Sendai Plain where the tsunami came rushing in and went as far as 5 kilometers onshore in some places. So these tsunamis of the sort that I'll be talking about mostly come from what are called subduction zone earthquake events. So around the Pacific and other places in the world, there are these high frequency of earthquakes because of the continental plates. The oceanic plate is spreading out and subducting or going beneath the continental plates, many places around the Pacific in particular, and where the heavier material in the ocean crust is diving underneath the continental crust. It's a sort of fluid dynamics problem on a very slow time scale, and it doesn't flow very smoothly. It tends to stick, sometimes for hundreds of years, and then suddenly let go. So as it's sticking here, you've got this material that's converging, coming together, trying to slip past each other, but it's not. So it's sort of squeezing the continental plate upwards and downwards near the point of contact here. And then when it slips during a big earthquake, you get a rebounding, and the seafloor underneath the ocean lifts up or drops down or some combination of those, and that disturbs the surface, which gives rise to the tsunami. So all around the Pacific in particular, but also in the Indian Ocean over here where the 2004 tsunami was, and various other places, there are these subduction zones that are very dangerous in terms of large tsunamis. And once the tsunami is generated, it propagates across the ocean. The speed at which the wave goes depends on the depth of the ocean. It varies as it goes, but typically in the deep ocean, it's going 400 or 500 miles an hour. The wave is not the water itself, but the wave that's going across the ocean. Okay, so where's the math in this, you might ask? This looks like geosciences. I'm a mathematician. I started out doing mathematics. Then I went to graduate school in a computer science department because I was interested in numerical methods. Then I got interested in software. Well, all of these things are kind of balled up in this kind of problem. So a lot of what we do in applied mathematics is develop mathematical models, systems of equations that can model something like a tsunami. And often these are partial differential equations, which are equations that relate the rate at which things are changing in space to the rate at which they're changing in time, for example. And once you have those sorts of equations, if they're simple enough equations, you can write down analytical solutions. But the kind of equations we look at for these complex situations, you usually can't write down any exact solution. And so you need some computational method or a numerical method to approximate the solution of the equations. Okay, and so what I started out doing mostly in my career was developing numerical methods for solving differential equations and then analyzing them. And then I got more and more interested in implementing these methods in software that could be used for a wide variety of problems. And the algorithms that have to be used are often very complex. And as I'll mention, we have to use things like adaptive mesh refinement. And often we're trying to use it on computers that have more than one processor that we're trying to use together. So there's a lot of interesting mathematics that comes into making all of that work. And then we look at applications with the software that often involves other kinds of mathematics. So in particular, I've gotten very interested in the tsunami problem, and I've been working on this largely for the last 10 years or so. But there's new kinds of mathematics I'm learning as a result of doing that. For example, I'll talk a little bit about probabilistic hazard assessment later, and uncertainty quantification, which is a big topic in scientific computing now because we almost never know exactly what the problem is we're trying to solve. There's often lots of uncertainty in it. So let's look a little more closely at the Tohoku event. This is the main island of Japan, Honshu here. The earthquake happened offshore here, so 5 minutes after the earthquake, there was a big wave that started propagating out. Within about half an hour, it was reaching the coast of Japan, and then this wave is moving much faster in deeper water, going out across the ocean. If I zoom in on this area right in here, this is what the wave looks like if we zoom in. It looks very pixelated. That's not because I zoomed into a bad image. It's because this is actually the computational grid that we're solving these equations on. So we're approximating the solution of partial differential equations by breaking the domain up into a bunch of little rectangles. And in each rectangle, we have a certain amount of water. And then where it's red, the water level is above sea level. Where it's dark blue, it's below sea level. Where it's green, there's no water at all. And in every time step, based on the relation between the height and neighboring grid cells and the velocities, we can figure out how it changes. So if more water is flowing into a cell than out, then the water level rises, for example. And that's a way of sort of discretizing these differential equations that can be used to model fluid dynamics like this. Okay, so when we zoom in here, it doesn't look like I've got enough resolution to really model what's going on the coast. This is actually the Sendai Plain up here, this sort of light green area where it's much flatter. If I were trying to model the inundation on that plain, I would have to use a much finer grid than what's shown here. On the other hand, if I zoom back out and what I'm interested in is this wave going across the ocean, then I don't need more resolution. This is a reasonable resolution for modeling the wave as it goes across the ocean. And if we really zoom out to look at the whole ocean, well, out here, we really don't need any resolution at all until the wave gets there. So here, this is North America and South America. We're not resolving things well at all. Here's Australia and Papua New Guinea. There's no reason to. But we do want to resolve things here. And as the wave spreads out, we want to sort of refine more and more of the ocean. So this is what's called adaptive mesh refinement. We use much finer grids in regions where the action is, much coarser grids elsewhere, because every time step we have to update values in every grid cell. So it gets very expensive if we had a very fine grid everywhere. So if you watch Papua New Guinea here, for example, as the wave approaches, you'll see that we refine it in time that when the wave gets there, we get a reasonable measure of the reflection that comes off of it. And then later, it gets de-refined again once we don't have any waves impacting there, for example. Okay. And now at this time, for example, we've started to resolve New Zealand, which is down here. And so at this point, what part of the ocean we might want to resolve and which parts we don't care about would depend on what it was we were trying to do. If we were trying to issue warnings for New Zealand, for example, we might not care about this wave over here at all, even though it's much bigger than what's happening down here. So in a particular simulation, we have to gear the way that we do this adaptive mesh refinement to what it is we really want to simulate. So I'm going to zoom in on New Zealand now. Here's New Zealand. This is from another computation where we were only interested in New Zealand, so I haven't resolved any of the other waves at this late time. This is 15 and a half hours after the earthquake. And this is zooming in on the North Island of New Zealand. And zooming in even finer, there's a harbor here, Tauranga Harbor, where there happened to be some gauges in place that measured the tsunami as it came into the harbor. And so we were interested in comparing the model with what was actually measured at those gauges. Particular case. And because we use this adaptive refinement where we really do the work only where we need to, you can do a simulation like this on my laptop, for example, in a few hours. Okay? Whereas if you tried to resolve the entire ocean to this scale, it would take probably years to do the same computation. So it's very important that we resolve things only where we need to. Here's going back to only 3 hours after the earthquake. So here was New Zealand and this harbor. 3 hours after the earthquake, we weren't resolving those at all, and it was only as the waves started to approach, 12 hours after the earthquake, that we started to resolve New Zealand, and we weren't at all resolving the harbor yet. But this only took 5 minutes of computer time to get to this point on the laptop. And it's only after you start refining around the harbor that it suddenly goes up to 3 hours. Okay? So how much time it takes depends on how large a region you're refining, but you're only sort of putting the work into the place that you care about. And this is what we actually measured at those gauges. So this is a zoom of that entrance to the harbor. There was a gauge out here where they measured the height of the fluid or the surface elevation as a function of time, which is shown here. The black is the measurements. The red is what came out of the simulation. There was another tide gauge inside the harbor here where we had this comparison. And then right in the entrance, there was an acoustic Doppler profiler that could actually measure the current velocity. And this was in particular for a workshop where we were looking at currents in harbors and trying to see how well different tsunamis do on currents in harbors. And so these bottom three are the velocity components at this point in the east-west and north-south direction and the total speed of the water at that point. And the results for the currents don't look quite as good as for the height. They're typically much harder to capture accurately. But you can see that even with this simulation that only took a few hours on a laptop, you can match pretty well with what happened and get basically the amplitude of this wave as it comes in. Yeah, this was a workshop that was just about a year ago or so in Portland, organized by the National Tsunami Hazard Mitigation Program, where there were, I think, about 10 different groups of tsunami modelers who have different models coming together and trying to understand better how well our models work for problems where we have strong currents that we're trying to model. Modeling inundation, the depth of inundation, is often easier than modeling the currents properly. So, for example, this is a whirlpool in a harbor that was generated during a tsunami. So in this region, the elevation of the water is relatively constant, but the velocity is changing dramatically as you go around there. And even if tsunami doesn't come onshore, it can do a lot of damage in harbors to boats and infrastructure if there's strong currents. So people are very interested in doing a better job of modeling the currents and understanding how well our current models do it at modeling currents. So that Tauranga Harbor case was one example that we looked at. Another interesting example that we looked at was a model of seaside Oregon. This is on the Oregon coast, and I'll talk later about the Cascadia Subduction Zone, which is offshore from Oregon, Washington, California, British Columbia, and which does have also magnitude 9 earthquakes every few hundred years. So there's a lot of concern in my part of the world about tsunami hazards and how to mitigate them. So this is an aerial view of just a small piece of seaside. We don't have an actual tsunami yet to compare against here. So they built a wave tank model of this in a wave tank at Oregon State University, which I'll show in a moment. But notice this sort of U-shaped large hotel here, the seawall here with this sort of semicircular turnaround here, and the other buildings along here. You'll see those in the model in just a second. So here's the scale model that they built. And so this is a wave tank where they can generate a wave at the far end that comes into this model that was built. Here's that U-shaped building, the other buildings along the coast. And then they could track how it comes in, both with cameras and also with gauges along several of these streets here, where they could measure the depth of the water, the velocities, the forces that the water is exerting, and so on as the wave comes in. And then what we did is try to use our numerical model to simulate this. So the model that we use for tsunami modeling that runs so fast uses something called the shallow water equations. Shallow water equations assume that everything is fairly uniform through the depth of the fluid, and you only have to worry about variations in the two lateral directions. The velocity is relatively constant, and we don't do the full three-dimensional fluid dynamics model, which would be much, much more expensive. But when you look at something like this, it doesn't look at all like what you would expect the shallow water equations to work well for. So you can put this into the shallow water equations. You can take these buildings and look at them as just being part of the topography that the water is going over. But I didn't expect to get good results at all when we tried this with the shallow water equations. I was actually surprised at how well even those simple equations do at modeling this sort of complex flow. So later, the water comes streaming up here, going between the buildings, overtopping some of the buildings, and so on. So when we do this with the shallow water model, this is now sort of turned sideways. Here's that U-shaped building. Here's that sort of semicircular part of the seawall. This is just as the wave is hitting that seawall. So the colors here are the depth of the water as it comes through the city. And what you see is that it comes rushing in here, starts going up the streets, overtops some of the buildings, but not this tallest hotel here. Comes up the streets. It makes very pretty pictures. Eventually, you see it streaming through the buildings here. It looks sort of qualitatively like what was seen in the experiment. But, of course, a pretty picture isn't enough. So we could also look at all of these gauge locations that are numbered here and compare what comes out of this sort of model with the actual measurements that were taken there. So if we do that, I'll show that on the next slide. But first of all, in addition to doing this two-dimensional modeling, I've been working with a professor in civil engineering, Mike Motley, and one of his students on looking at full three-dimensional fluid dynamics modeling, which for this particular situation seems like it might be necessary. So this is just a snapshot of one of their simulations. They had to sort of break it up into smaller pieces because it's much more computer intensive to solve things in 3 dimensions. This is, I think, these two buildings down here, this particular part of the simulation that they were doing. But they can actually model the full 3-dimensional flow, the turbulence of it, the splashing over buildings and whatnot. So we were interested how well does a two-dimensional model do compared to this? And we looked at lots of different gauge locations. This is just a few of them. And the top plot here is the depth as a function of time at one particular gauge, the velocity or the speed of the water, and the momentum flux, which is kind of a measure of the force that the water is exerting as a function of time. And there's three different curves here. The black, I think, is the measurement. The green is the three-dimensional model, and the yellowish golden curve is the two-dimensional model. So as I said, it looks better than I would have expected. And there's some improvement by going to 3D, but not a huge amount. So there are cases where you might need to do 3D modeling. In particular, if you're interested in one particular building and you want to know what are the forces on that structure, we might want to go to doing a three-dimensional model. But you can do a lot with a two-dimensional model. And it runs in only 5 or 6 hours on a laptop rather than 8 to 10 days on 128 cores. So we're also looking, as I mentioned, at probabilistic hazard assessment, where you don't want to just do one such simulation. You want to try out lots of different tsunamis coming from different size earthquakes. And so we're looking at ways you can take a lot of simulations with the simple 2D model and combine them with a few on a full 3D model, for example, and get a better estimation in a lot less time than doing everything in 3 dimensions. Okay, so there's a quote from the statistician George Box from the 70s, I think. All models are wrong, but some are useful. And that's, it's an important thing to keep in mind as an applied mathematician, that anytime you write down a mathematical model, it's not going to be exactly right, no matter how complex you make it. It may or may not be useful, and sometimes simple models are even more useful than complex models. Depends on what you're trying to do, and a big part of sort of being an applied mathematician is figuring out what's the right model to model the phenomenon that you're looking at, and how can you make it work well. So in the field of geohazards, I'd say there's been a lot of developments over the last few decades that have really dramatically improved the ability to do modeling of this sort of thing. The geophysics is better understood now than it was before in many ways. There's a lot of data available, both from laboratories and from real events and from observations out in the field. Better mathematical models have been developed of various sorts. Numerical algorithms and software has improved, and computers are, of course, much faster than they were decades ago. And so putting this all together, this is really sort of, I think, a golden age of doing mathematical and computational modeling in geophysics. And there's lots of problems that need tackling in this realm. So what do we use models for? Well, several things. We use them to better understand the geophysics and understand past events. I'll give some examples of this in a moment. We can even use models to understand prehistoric tsunamis where there weren't any observations. It's used, of course, in real-time forecasting or warning. As I mentioned, in tsunamis, you might have 10 hours before a tsunami reaches the other side of the ocean to do some simulations and to determine where you have to evacuate. Our code has also been used for hurricane surge and storm surge in general, where you might have several days before the storm actually makes landfall, but then there's a lot of uncertainty about exactly where it's going to hit, so you might have to do lots of simulations in the meantime. We're also involved at the University of Washington in a project on early earthquake warning, which means having warning of a minute or two between when the earthquake happens and when the waves reach Seattle, for example. And coupling that also with tsunami warnings for Puget Sound, for example. And then the other thing that we've been involved in quite a bit recently is hazard mapping, and looking at a community like Seaside, Oregon, or Crescent City, California, or various places on the Washington coast, and trying to understand what the hazards are there, what areas are in most danger of flooding, and in some cases doing probabilistic hazard assessment for that. So I mentioned that we can often figure out something about prehistoric earthquakes and tsunamis even if they weren't observed. So one of the key tools that's used to do that is looking at what's called tsunami deposits. So a tsunami deposit is what's left behind after a tsunami recedes. So if you've got a nice sort of marshy area here with a shoreline, and then a tsunami comes in, it carries a lot of sand and marine microorganisms and other things in from the ocean with it, and as it recedes, it leaves behind a layer of sand typically and other things. And if this happens many times over several centuries, you can often find layers of these things interspersed with maybe peat or soil or other things that have been deposited in between the different tsunamis. So then if you go out in the field in a place where you think there have been tsunamis, you can dig in various places and often find many layers of past tsunamis. So this is a picture that was taken actually shortly after the 2004 tsunami in the Indian Ocean in Thailand. And the top layer of sand here that's on the surface was the deposit that was laid down by that 2004 event. And underneath that was peat that had been building up for several hundred years before that. But underneath that is another sand layer from a big tsunami, and then other soil layers and sand layers going on down. So by studying various locations and also looking how far in do these various deposits carry on, you can get some idea both of the ages of past big earthquakes and also how big they were relative to each other based on how far inland they went, for example. So a lot of what we know about past earthquakes comes from this kind of work. This is a slide that one of my colleagues, Jody Bourgeois, in the Earth and Space Sciences department at UW gave me of some pictures she took on the Sendai Plain, actually, in 2010, a year before the big tsunami there. She was on a field trip where they were looking. It was well known in Japan, of course, that there have been many tsunamis in the past. And here they were digging down with this device that you stick down into the ground, pull out a sample of the soil, and when you look at it, you can find here, for example, is a sand layer that they dated to the what's called the Jogan tsunami in the year 869, which has also been observed many other places in Japan, and for which there's actually still historical records in Japan. And this, for example, is a layer of volcanic ash from a volcanic eruption in 915, which is another way you can try to date these layers. I like this slide because it also had a picture of Daisuke Sugawara, who's a tsunami sedimentologist who works at Tohoku University, and I had the pleasure of meeting him last fall on Kauai. We're kind of collapsed here after carrying a big tripod that I'll show you in a moment through the mud. We were on the island of Kauai in November with a group organized by the USGS to look for tsunami deposits in a marsh near Anahola up here. And I think it's important for applied mathematicians to get our hands dirty. I didn't get quite as dirty as these guys, but it's important to work with the people who are gathering data that you're using, see what they do in the lab or out in the field if possible. So I was happy to have an opportunity to go out and observe what they do. A better question might be, why did they invite a mathematician to go out, especially an out-of-shape, somewhat elderly mathematician at this point, to go out when they had young guys like this to carry equipment around? Well, it's because they were doing modeling with our software to try to understand tsunami deposits on this island. There was an interesting discovery just a couple of years ago in this cave, the Makawahi Cave, which is on the southern coast of Kauai. This cave is about 100 meters in from the shore and about 7 meters above sea level. And deep in the cave, they found a layer of sand, a large deposit of sand that they thought was from a tsunami. Another group had found that a couple of years before. And so this USGS team was going to the island and trying to look in some other locations to see if they could find deposits that correlated with that. This they had dated to about 400 or 500 years ago, and there wasn't a tsunami that was known that would have given that big of a deposit around that time. So they were hoping to find other things, and they were using numerical modeling to try to figure out if an earthquake was at various different locations, how much of a deposit would it make in various points along the coast in Kauai. So in addition to slogging around in the mud in the day, we were doing numerical modeling in the evening with some of the modelers from the Santa Cruz office of the USGS. And in particular, it had been proposed in this original paper announcing the discovery of this cave deposit that perhaps the tsunami originated from the Aleutian Islands. This is an extension of Alaska's up here and then the Aleutian Island arc as a potential location for that tsunami. So we were doing some modeling, putting the tsunami source there and various other places to see how much of a deposit could one expect to see in Anahola. This is the marsh around Anahola that we were looking in, and how much of a wave would it create around where this cave was. So this is the tripod I mentioned. This was another kind of coring that they do rather than just sticking a sort of gouge pipe down in the ground. They have this very long pipe, a fairly large diameter, that they try to drive all the way down into the marsh so they can go much deeper. And the way they do that is by hooking it up to a vibrating motor here that's kind of like a jackhammer motor that vibrates this pole, and then they pull down on it or step on the handles and push it down into the ground and then move the handles up and repeat that several times. And they could drive this long pole all the way down into the marsh, and then they ratchet it back out again, cut it up into pieces, and ship the pieces off to Oregon State, I guess in this case, where they actually put these tubes into a CAT scanner to get three-dimensional images of what the structure of the sand was in these deposits that they hope to find in these tubes. And then they cut them open and looked at them after doing that. But they can often tell a lot from just the structure of the grains and the order in which different grain sizes are deposited. They can tell something about the fluid dynamics during a tsunami. So they gather as much data as they can. And they did this at lots of different points in this marsh. And this is just one of the cartoon of the cross-section they found in one of these big cores that they took, where there was a layer of marshy peat up at the top, and then there was a layer of sand that was dated to a known tsunami in 1946 that came in here, and then there was a lot more soil, and then there was a deposit down here that correlates with what was found in the cave at being about 1400 or so this data is still being analyzed, and they're still doing numerical modeling. This is very much sort of research in progress, but this is the kind of thing that can be done with some assistance, at least from numerical models. So I mentioned that up near Seattle, we have the Cascadia Subduction Zone, which runs from British Columbia down to California. This is a tsunami, this subduction zone had an earthquake in the year 1700 that created a tsunami that was measured in Japan over here. But for a long time, it wasn't known where that tsunami originated from. There were measurements in Japan of this big wave that came in from somewhere. But, of course, at the time, they had no idea where it came from. And there weren't any historical records, most other places in the world, that would correlate at all with a big earthquake around that year. And it was really only in the 1980s or so that this was sort of pieced together, in part looking at tsunami deposits in Washington State and looking at trees that had been killed when marshes dropped and salt water came in and killed the trees. And looking at the tree rings, they could actually determine that the trees had died in the year 1699 or 1700. And so that correlated very well with these records in Japan. Another one of my colleagues in Seattle, Brian Atwater, did a lot of this work back in the 80s, working with a number of people in Japan on this. So this is kind of a cross-section of our Cascadia Subduction Zone. Seattle is up here on the Puget Sound, Vancouver Island. So there's sort of upwelling of hot magma from under the earth here that cools down and becomes this very dense oceanic plate that sinks down underneath the continent over very long timescales. And it sticks along here all the way along this subduction zone that starts up here in Vancouver Island and goes down to California. So we know that now from a lot of other work that's been done that there's a big magnitude 9 earthquake every 500 years or so on average. They've found 19 past events in the geological record over the last 10,000 years. This is just one of those sort of records. This is from Bradley Lake on the coast of Oregon, which has been a very good sort of recorder of tsunamis over the centuries. So going back to 7,300 years ago, they found evidence of 17 different events here that they could correlate at different locations within the lake. And then they also look at what's going on offshore. Chris Goldfinger at Oregon State has spent much of his career looking at what's called turbidites, which is deposits that are deposited off the continental shelf. When there's a big earthquake, there are often landslides that happen underwater, submarine landslides along the continental slope here that leave deposits down below. And by taking cores off of ships, they can analyze these cores and find offshore records of many past earthquakes and then try to correlate those with what's seen in the onshore record. So putting all of that information and various other sorts of data together, they end up with this sort of record of what's happened over the last 10,000 years. So here we are. This is going back to, here's the invention of the wheel, going back to 10,000 years ago. And they've been able to date with some precision. These dark red lines are the magnitude 9 type earthquakes, 19 of them. And the smaller red lines are magnitude 8 or bigger earthquakes. So there's a rich record of past earthquakes in this area. So there's a lot of concern, naturally, on the West Coast about when the next such event is going to happen. We don't know, but it could be tomorrow. It could be another 200 or 300 years. But we're trying to prepare for it. So here's a map that sort of shows the extent of that Cascadia Subduction Zone a little bit better. And one place we've looked at, we've been doing quite a bit of work recently on sort of inundation modeling along the coast of Washington for the state of Washington for the new generation of tsunami inundation maps they're looking at. This is Nia Bay, which is right up here at the tip of the Olympic Peninsula, the sort of northwesternmost point in the continental U.S., which is part of the Makah Indian nation. So there's a community here of Nia Bay and some tribal buildings down here. This is looking through that valley. There's actually Indian history of the 1700 event. It turns out once people started asking about it, that said that this whole valley was in fact flooded during that event. And so there's a lot of concern in that area now. They have these, it says tsunami ready on the side of it. It's a big container that's up at some elevation here. There's several of these near that valley so that people can hopefully get to high ground and have emergency supplies up there. This is two of my close collaborators, Frank Gonzalez and Lois Adams. Many of you know Lois. She's also my wife, but she's a professor of applied mathematics as well. And she and Frank and I have been working a lot together on these tsunami inundation projects. Frank was the director of the NOAA Tsunami Center for Tsunami Research at NOAA in Seattle until he retired from there a few years ago, and now works mostly at the university and works with us on these projects. So let me show you one other. Actually, before I do that, let me see if I can get a movie to work here. Yeah, so this is a simulation of what a magnitude 9 tsunami might look like off the coast. So Nia Bay is right up here. This is the Strait of Juan de Fuca, which goes into Puget Sound in here. Seattle is actually down just off the map here. So we've done quite a bit of modeling along the coast here, and more recently along the Strait of Juan de Fuca. There's some regions here where you get very large run-up, even well-protected areas. What seem to be well-protected in here, you get waves that come in many hours after the earthquake happens. And if we zoom in now on Nia Bay, I can find that here. So this is the valley, the Wash River Valley, with high ground on either side. But as the tsunami comes in, it comes in from both sides of this valley. So these sort of simulations can give people an idea of both what area might be inundated and also how much time they might have until the waves start arriving. So another area that we've looked at, which is farther down on the Olympic Peninsula coast, is Grays Harbor, which is bordered by two sand spits, basically, very low-lying sand spits, which have been built up quite a bit with communities at this point. And unfortunately, these regions are almost impossible to evacuate in the available time. It's very hard to get off of this peninsula. It takes a while, even if there hasn't just been a huge earthquake that's damaged the streets and knocked down trees and power lines and things. So there's a lot of concern in these areas about what would they do if one of these big earthquakes hits. And you can see from the simulation that they really don't have very much time. This is 40 minutes after the earthquake, and this is, well, the color scale is saturating about 5 meters. So that's a lot of water coming over this peninsula. We were looking in particular at this region right here, where there's a school, two schools actually, elementary school and a high school. If we zoom in on that area, this sort of shows the maximum water depth and a cross-section transect cutting across through where this elementary school is, which shows that the water goes up to 13 meters or so near the coast. And then there's some sort of low-lying ridges that protect the school to some extent. But if you do other simulations where you assume those ridges might get washed away, or if you look at an even bigger event, you can get some flooding in this area. But nonetheless, the schools are there, and they were planning on rebuilding the elementary school. So the idea arose to use this as a vertical evacuation structure. So there's a project that's been going on between the University of Washington and the various state agencies, the National Tsunami Hazard Mitigation Program, and others, called Project Safe Haven, to try to design vertical evacuation structures at various points along the coast where it's impossible to get to natural high ground. So the idea is you build towers that people can evacuate to, or you use buildings that would otherwise be used for other things like a school, but you put on the roof an evacuation area that's safe, or you build a large berm. You take, for example, a playground and you raise it up tens of meters so it's much higher and create some artificial high ground. So there were a whole bunch of regions along the Washington coast that were studied as potential locations for these vertical evacuation structures. There's a number of these structures in Japan and some other countries, but until now, there hasn't been one in the United States. So the first one in the US will be the Socosta Elementary School that's being rebuilt now. I was at the opening ceremony about a year ago, which was cute. All the kids had clam diggers for doing the ground breaking, which is appropriate for that community. But the idea is that the gymnasium of this school will have a tsunami safe area on the top that could hold up to 1,000 people during an event. Hopefully the water would not get this steep. Our simulations didn't show it getting that deep, but that's the idea. This was sort of an artist rendition from a nice video on Project Safe Haven, if you're interested, that the Washington Department of Transportation put together on the sort of process of bringing people together to design and build this school. This elementary school was actually in need of replacement for many years, and there had been 2 bond issues to try to replace it previously that had failed. And then when they added this tsunami evacuation structure, even though that made it somewhat more expensive, the next bond issue passed 70-30. So the community really came together to try to do this for the kids and hopefully for other people in the community around as well. Okay, so in the remaining time, I wanted to just briefly give you an idea of what probabilistic tsunami hazard assessment is all about. So the simulations I showed were one particular tsunami inundating regions. So you have to assume something about how big is the earthquake, how close to the surface is it, how much does the seafloor move to generate the tsunami. But we really don't know what the next Cascadia Subduction Zone earthquake is going to look like. And so what we'd like to do is run tsunami simulations with lots of hypothetical earthquakes chosen from some probability distribution that the geoscientists tell us is an appropriate thing to use to model potential earthquakes, and then figure out as efficiently as possible what regions are more at risk, what regions are less at risk, what things we have to worry about. I also mentioned that we're getting involved in early earthquake warning and connected with that tsunami warning. So for example, if there's an earthquake offshore, these dart buoys, which are way out in the Pacific, aren't much help in terms of warning people in Washington state. By the time the tsunami gets to those, it's too late. But as a tsunami comes in the Strait of Juan de Fuca, for example, if we could measure it there, maybe we could issue better warnings for Puget Sound. So there's an effort underway to put better instrumentation along the continental shelf and in the Strait of Juan de Fuca up around Washington. So one part of that we're working on now is trying to figure out what sort of sensors make sense to have out there. How many do you need? Where should you put them? And so on. And for that, you also need to generate sort of random earthquakes and test things out a lot. So we looked in particular at Crescent City, California, which has often been hit by tsunamis. It's the way it's shaped. There's a harbor here. The way it's shaped and the fact that it's close to an offshore underwater ridge that kind of acts as a wave guide and guides tsunamis right in towards Crescent City means that Crescent City has often been hit by tsunamis. So much of the downtown area was destroyed in 1964 from the earthquake in Alaska. At that time, it was the city on the west coast of the U.S. that was most affected, I think, by that earthquake outside of Alaska. And pretty much any tsunami in the Pacific has an effect here. The Tohoku event 5 years ago caused a large amount of damage in the harbor, even though it didn't inundate onshore. They're doing like a $30 million renovation of the harbor there because many of the docks were destroyed. So this is kind of a traditional inundation map that has sort of one line as the inundation zone that's based on some credible worst case sort of scenario. But as I mentioned, there's a wide range of possible earthquakes and sizes of the resulting tsunami that could happen here. So we were involved in a project funded by FEMA to try to come up with better ways to do probabilistic hazard assessment and replace this sort of map with maps that show regions that might flood with different probabilities. So sort of preliminary results from that study are shown here. So this is that same harbor area and the city. This is actually going up farther north than the previous map did. The kind of greenish region here is that these are the annual probability for different regions based on the colors. The kind of greenish region is around 0.0025 annual probability, which is 1 over 400. So that's like a 400-year event. So this Cascadia Subduction Zone, we think a big earthquake happens there maybe every 500 years, but there's also earthquakes in Alaska you have to worry about and other things. So when you put all of that together and also look at Chile and the Aleutian Islands and various other potential tsunami sources, you can come up with this sort of hazard map. And so the greenish area here kind of agrees with the yellow area here, even this little part over here. But you see there's a much bigger region that might flood with smaller probability. So these are much more rare events, but if you consider the possibility that we might have a much bigger tsunami than the one that was used for that previous map, then there's larger parts of the city and surrounding areas that one might have to worry about. So that's kind of where that project is going. To do that, we have to generate random earthquakes. So these are a couple of real earthquakes. This is the Tohoku event and the Chile 2010 off the coast of Male, Chile. What you're seeing here, this is Japan over here in the ocean. What you're seeing in this rectangle is sort of a top-down view of the subduction zone projected up to the surface here. And the colors represent where there's more slip or less slip. So the red colors are the most slip. Blue, there's very little slip. And one of the reasons the Tohoku tsunami was so bad was that there was a very high concentration of slip in a fairly small area that was at the up-dip edge. This part over here is dipping down underneath Japan. This is the edge that's closest to the seafloor, and that's where most of the slip was concentrated. Actually went up to 50 meters of slip of the rock down under the earth, and that caused a corresponding uplift of a large amount of water. Okay? If the same magnitude tsunami, the magnitude is based on the total slip sort of integrated or summed over the entire fault plane. If you'd spread it out differently, you would have gotten a very different looking tsunami. So if we're looking at sort of hypothetical events in the future, we have to sort of generate different random slip patterns that have some statistical properties that we think are reasonable, and then do our tsunami modeling with each of those different initial conditions. So this can be hard for something like the Cascadia Subduction Zone, which I mentioned is 1,100, 1,200 kilometers long. And so one thing we've been looking at, I'll finally throw in an equation for the mathematicians in the audience. One thing we've been looking at is sort of a way to generate random slip patterns that have the desired statistical properties. So the idea is to take this big long fault and split it up into a bunch of little pieces. I think there were 865 or something little subfaults here, and then assign random slips to each of those. But you'd like to do it in a way that they're sort of correlated. If you've got big slip on one rectangle, you expect the slip on the neighboring rectangle to also be pretty big, whereas a rectangle farther away might not be so well correlated. So you can make some assumptions about sort of what the correlation length is and use that to define what's called a covariance matrix, which in this case would be 865 by 865 matrix, where the ij element would tell you the covariance of slip on one patch to slip on some other patch. And then if you take that matrix and you compute its eigenvalues and eigenvectors, if you're familiar with that, it turns out the eigenvectors can be used as a basis for representing random slip patterns. And if you take just a linear combination, a sum of those particular slip patterns, these V sub k's, are the eigenvectors of this covariance matrix, and you weight them by just random numbers that are uncorrelated, and also another weighting that depends on the size of the eigenvalues and how they decay. It turns out you can generate random patterns that have exactly the covariance structure that you asked for in the beginning. So you can generate easily arbitrary number of realizations that all have the same sort of the right sort of correlation between slip on different parts of the fault. Okay, so if you look at those eigenvectors, if you're familiar with Fourier series at all, these look sort of like Fourier modes, but shaped to match the shape of this Cascadia subduction zone. So the eigenvector that corresponds to the largest eigenvalue, if you view it, the 865 elements in that vector as a slip pattern on the fault, it's basically constant everywhere. So adding in some multiple of that changes the magnitude of the earthquake, up or down. The next largest eigenvalue corresponds to an eigenvector or eigenfunction that basically redistributes slip between the down dip, the deep part of the fault, and the up dip part closest to the surface. So in these plots, the red is +1 and the blue, dark blue, is -1, and adding a positive or negative multiple of this is sort of shifting the slip around. Similarly, this next one shifts the slip between the north and the south, and then this one is kind of a checkerboard pattern that rearranges it. And if you look at the higher eigenvectors, they're more and more oscillatory, and then by taking combinations of them weighted by the eigenvalues, which decay depending on how long your correlation length was, you can generate random patterns of slip like these, for example, that have the right statistics if you start looking at how is the slip correlated. So some of these slip patterns have a lot of slip concentrated in one place. Others, like this one, have slip spread out all along the up-dip edge closest to the surface. Others have the slip more down in the south and down deep in the fault, but you can generate arbitrary number of realizations. Okay, so that's kind of another work in progress that we've been thinking about a lot lately, but there's a dozen other things that I could tell you about tsunamis alone in terms of where mathematics comes into kind of understanding the phenomena, but I'll leave it at that. And just mention that there's a huge number of people I should thank that have been involved in this over the years. I wanted to mention a couple in particular. So this GeoClaw software that we've been developing, it grew out of a package called ClawPack that we started about 20 years ago now, which stands for Conservation Laws Package. Conservation law in the sense of conservation of mass and momentum, for example, in shallow water equations. And then I had a student, Dave George, who started looking at the tsunami modeling about 10 years ago as his thesis project. He now works at the USGS Cascades Volcano Observatory near Portland, where they study all sorts of interesting volcanic phenomena, flow of lava, of ash plumes, of debris flows and lahars. And he's been adapting this code to look at landslides and debris flows in particular, which also cover a large extent, and you might want to use adaptive refinement to sort of follow the important parts of it. Kyle Manley, another former student now at Columbia, has been looking at storm surge and modeling the surge that comes in with a hurricane or a tropical storm. Marcia Berger, I've worked with ever since our grad school days. We were students together at Stanford, and her thesis was on adaptive mesh refinement for these sorts of problems. So she's been involved in this project from the beginning. And recently, we started working together on a project funded by NASA. She spends her summers at NASA usually. And this is an asteroid impact tsunami problem. What happens if an asteroid hits the ocean? How big of a tsunami will that cause? NASA's interested. They track a lot of rocks out there in space that might someday potentially hit the Earth, and they want to know what size rocks do they have to track, which ones can they ignore, and they're interested in knowing in particular about tsunamis. So this is maybe here in Minnesota, the only kind of tsunamis you really have to worry about is if an asteroid hits one of the lakes. So that should be of interest to you here. There's a bunch of other people who've been involved in these various tsunami projects over the years, a lot of students and collaborators elsewhere. Numerous tsunami sedimentologists, seismologists, civil engineers who've been very generous in sharing with me their knowledge of these topics and that I've worked with on some of these projects. Lots of other students, and we've had funding from various sources. So I'll stop there, but happy to take any questions.
you're probably all glad to be living in Minnesota. But if you have any questions about the topic of tonight's talk, you're welcome to ask a question or two. Anybody? Someone here? Go ahead. Sure.
In terms of distributing the equipment for measuring, I guess the flows onto or the waves, I suppose, are any nations at a disadvantage in terms of being able to afford this equipment? Are some favored, and I guess how is that distribution relate to, I guess, the best way of diagnosing these trends?
Yeah, so these dart buoys that are out in the Pacific, they're the ones that I showed you are operated by the U.S. and were put in place by the U.S. and are used by the warning centers. There's a tsunami warning center in Hawaii and another one in Alaska where they take data in real time that comes in from those and also seismic data. And they have an automatic procedure that can very rapidly try to solve the inverse problem when you've measured some data, figuring out what were the initial conditions, how did the Earth move to create that tsunami. And then the predictions that they make, they broadcast by email to a wide set of people. So I'm on their email list, and lots of people from other countries are on the list. And so that warning goes out to all of the countries around the Pacific Rim. And there are other countries who do their own warning and often share the predictions as they're done. Unfortunately, these dart buoys, they're very expensive to put in place because they're in very deep water. They're also expensive to maintain, and they tend to get vandalized, unfortunately, by people who sell them for spare parts or something when they find them out in the ocean. And so there's a real problem keeping these things in operation. So after the Indian Ocean tsunami, there was really no warning system in the Indian Ocean. So even though a lot of people knew that there was a tsunami going across the ocean that was going to hit India and Sri Lanka and other distant shores in several hours, there was really no way to get the word out to many of the communities on the coast. So that in the 15 years or so now since the 2004 tsunami in the Indian Ocean, there's been a lot of work done on sort of building up infrastructure in the Indian Ocean. A number of countries in Europe have been involved in building up better warning systems there. But I just read an article in the paper a couple of days ago about the pressure gauges that they had in the Indian Ocean. A lot of those have been vandalized now. So there was an earthquake there just a couple of weeks ago, and the warning system that was out in the ocean was not working, I guess, at least not at full capacity. So this is a real problem, finding the funding to maintain these warning systems, install new equipment, and keep it all operating.
Just ask the question out loud.
Okay. In the 2D plots you showed us, in the 3 simulations, you had a color scale for the height of the water. Is that the only variable you had to keep track of, or there were others that were not displayed that also need to be computed?
Yeah, so the question was in the 2-dimensional plots where I was showing the tsunami propagating out, and dark red was above sea level, dark blue was below sea level. That's the sort of based on the depth of the fluid in each grid cell relative to the ocean topography or the bathymetry, the underwater topography in that particular cell. But to solve the equations, we have to keep track not only of the depth in every cell, but also the velocities, the velocity in the east-west direction and in the north-south direction. And the differential equations relate all of those things together. So if you have more flow coming into a cell than going out, then the depth increases, for example. If you have more depth in one cell than the neighboring cells, then that pressure accelerates the fluid and leads to change in the velocity of the fluid, and so the derivative of the velocity is related to the spatial variation in the depth, for example. So it's all together in one big coupled system of differential equations.
How did some things from the others, like from the other side of the world, could that also be a variable in the results and how much water goes into what you're trying to find out?
So things happening on the other side of the world, do you mean maybe something that's farther away than the Pacific, possibly giving a tsunami that would come into the Pacific and affect areas? That can happen. So the tsunamis that we were looking at, I only showed simulations where it was sort of staying in the Pacific, but it does go down around the tip of South America and into the Atlantic. It tends to get weaker and weaker as it goes farther away, and as it goes around the corner like that, it weakens quite a bit. So there wasn't really much of an observed tsunami in the Atlantic, for example, from the Tohoku event. But in general, you do have to look at the wave possibly going from one ocean through channels into other waterways.
Other tsunamis, could that also affect how strong the main body of water is?
Could other tsunamis affect the tsunami we're modeling? Well, I guess if you had two earthquakes happening simultaneously at different locations, then those waves would combine together. Luckily, that doesn't tend to happen, or we might have even more trouble. You also might worry about on the Pacific Rim where we have volcanoes, we also look at volcanic hazards, and sometimes there's some coupling between tsunamis or earthquakes and volcanoes, but typically we haven't seen them happen at exactly the same time.
Okay, let's thank Randy again. Thank you very much for a nice talk.